dust of Elias Thorne's life had long since settled into a fine gray film that covered everything he owned, everything he was. It lay upon the sills of his silent cabin, a testament to the windows never being opened to a woman's laugh. It coated the unused tin plates stacked in the cupboard, a gritty memorial to meals once shared. The land itself, a sprawling canvas of ochre and sage under a Wyoming sky too vast for one man's grief, seemed to breathe dust. Each gust of wind across the plains was a sigh from the earth, whispering of solitude, of endings. Elias was a man carved from the same hard rock and sun-baked timber as his ranch. His hands, calloused and mapped with the fine lines of 1,000 labors, knew the language of rope and leather and wood, but had forgotten the dialect of a gentle touch. His face was a landscape of its own, weathered by sun and sorrow, his eyes the color of a stormy sky holding back rain that would never fall. It had been 5 years since the fever took Martha and their boy Samuel, 5 years since the silence had descended, a weight heavier than any winter snow. He moved through his days with the economy of a man who has nothing left to waste. His actions precise, his words fewer still. He tended his cattle, mended his fences, and watched the sun rise and set, each day a perfect, painful replica of the one before. The silence was his companion, his penance, his home. But on this day, the silence was broken. It was not the familiar complaint of a loose floorboard or the cry of a hawk circling overhead. It was a sound that did not belong, a soft, furtive rustle from the deep shadows of his barn, a sound like a mouse, but with the weight of a secret. Elias stilled, his hand resting on the worn handle of the barn door. He was not a man given to flights of fancy, a wild creature most likely, a coyote seeking shelter, or perhaps a raccoon pilfering his grain. He pushed the heavy door open, its groan echoing the ache in his own bones. A spear of late afternoon light cut through the gloom, illuminating a vortex of dancing dust motes. The air was thick with the scent of hay and horses and old leather, and something else. Fear. It was a smell as potent as blood, a sharp metallic tang in the back of his throat. His eyes, accustomed to the dimness, swept the familiar space, the stalls, the tack hanging from whitten pegs, the loft piled high with winter feed. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement in the furthest stall, the one where he had kept Martha's gentle mare before she, too, had passed. He moved slowly, his boots scuffing softly on the hard-packed earth. He did not reach for the rifle propped against the wall. This was not a predator to be shot. This was something else. He rounded the edge of the stall, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Curled in the corner, nestled into a pile of old straw like a desperate field mouse, was a girl, or what was left of one. Her hair was a tangled mat of black, strewn with bits of hay and dirt. Her dress was little more than rags, torn and stained, clinging to a frame so skeletal he could count the ribs beneath the thin fabric. Her face, smudged with grime and tears, was turned away from him, buried in her knees, but it was her hands that held him captive. They were clenched into tiny white-knuckled fists, trembling with a force that seemed to shake her entire body. She was a thing of pure, unadulterated terror, a being who had run so far from a nameless horror that she had run out of world. He took a step closer, and a sound escaped her, a dry, ragged gasp, the sound of a creature that has forgotten how to scream. She flinched, pressing herself deeper into the corner, as if she could will herself into the very wood of the barn walls. Elias stopped. The silence rushed back in, but it was different now. It was charged, electric, filled with the frantic beating of a terrified heart. He stood there for a long time, a statue of dusty denim and quiet grief, watching the trembling girl in the straw. The hawk cried out again, a lonely sound in the vast emptiness, and in that moment, Elias Thorne felt the first crack appear in the settled dust of his soul. He remained motionless for a time that stretched between two heartbeats and an eternity. The man in him, the one who had buried a wife and child, saw not an intruder or a vagrant, but a profound and terrible fragility. He saw the sharp jut of a shoulder blade, the hollowed-out space behind a fragile neck. He saw a sorrow so immense it had consumed the flesh from her bones. This was not a threat to be managed. It was a wound to be tended. He backed away slowly, deliberately, making sure his movements were seen, that they were unthreatening. He did not turn his back on her, not yet. He retreated to the wide-open doorway of the barn, letting the rectangle of golden light frame him, making himself a clear and readable silhouette against the world outside. He held up his empty hands, a gesture as old as mankind, a universal sign of peace. She didn't move, her form still a tight knot of misery in the shadows. Elias turned and walked with measured steps to the water pump that stood between the barn and the house. The rhythmic squeak and clank of the handle was a familiar, domestic sound, a sound of life and routine. He pumped the cool, clear water into a tin cup, the one he always used, its edges worn smooth. He could feel her watching him, he was sure of it. The terror was a living thing in the air, and it had eyes. He walked back to the barn door and placed the cup on the ground, just inside the threshold of light, far enough from her that she would have to choose to approach it, but close enough to be a clear offering. Then he retreated again, walking to the porch of his cabin, where he sat down on the top step, his back to the barn, giving her the gift of his absence. He sat and watched the sun bleed its colors across the western sky, painting the clouds in hues of rose and violet, the colors Martha had loved. He did not look back. He listened. He listened for the scrape of the tin cup on the dirt floor, for the sound of desperate, ragged swallowing. For a long time there was nothing but the whisper of the wind and the settling groans of the old wood. Then, faint and hesitant, it came, a soft scuffling, a pause, the metallic slide of the cup. He closed his eyes, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding escaping his lips. It was a start. He went inside his cabin, the interior as still and quiet as a prayer. He moved to the hearth, lighting a small fire, not for warmth, but for the life it offered, the way the dancing flames could chase away the deepest shadows. He cut a thick slice of bread from the loaf he had baked 2 days prior and ladled a portion of thin stew from the pot on the stove into a bowl. It wasn't much, but it was food. It was sustenance. He carried the bowl and bread back to the barn, placing it on the ground beside where the cup had been. The cup was gone. He looked toward the stall. In the deepening gloom he could just make out her shape. She had not moved from her corner, but she was holding the empty cup in her lap, her fingers wrapped around it as if it were a precious idol. He said nothing. Words were stones that could shatter a silence this fragile. He simply left the food and returned once more to his porch, a silent, patient sentinel as dusk settled over the lonely plains, waiting for a life to decide to go on living. He proposed the house with a gesture. After she had devoured the bread and stew with the ferocity of a starving wolf, leaving the bowl scraped clean, Elias had risen from his porch steps. The moon had climbed high, a sliver of bone in a black velvet sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the yard. He walked back to the barn, his shadow preceding him like a silent envoy. He carried a lantern this time, its warm yellow glow a small bubble of civilization in the vast wild darkness. She was still in the corner, the empty bowl now cradled with the cup. When the lantern light fell upon her, she flinched. But it was a lesser flinch than before. The edge of her terror had been blunted by the simple, undeniable mercy of food and water. Elias stopped a respectful distance away. He held the lantern up slightly, then gestured with his head toward the small, sturdy cabin behind him. It was a simple invitation, an offering of walls and a roof against the cold, and the unknown things that hunted in the night. He didn't know if she understood the gesture or if she simply understood the tone of it, the quiet, undemanding offer of sanctuary. For a long moment she stared at him, her eyes wide and dark in her pale, grimy face. He saw a flicker of indecision, a war between a fear that had been her only companion for God knew how long and a desperate primal need for safety. He waited, his patience a deep, calm well. He did not press, did not move closer. The choice had to be hers. If she stayed in the barn, he would leave her be. She would bring her food in the morning. But the night was growing cold, and the wind carried a new chill, a promise of frost. Slowly, hesitantly, as if her limbs were made of glass, she began to unfold. She rose to her feet, swaying slightly, her body unaccustomed to standing. She was taller than he'd thought, but so thin she seemed almost translucent in the lantern light. She took a single, faltering step out of the stall, then another. She walked toward him as a person walks toward a ghost, with a mixture of dread and morbid curiosity. He turned and began to walk toward the cabin, not looking back to see if she was following, but listening for the soft, uncertain fall of her bare feet on the cool earth. He heard them. Step by hesitant step, she followed him across the yard, a shadow clinging to his light. He opened the cabin door and stepped inside, holding it for her. The interior was Spartan, clean and suffocatingly male. The air smelled of wood smoke, old books, and loneliness. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, its light glinting off the faded photograph on the mantelpiece. A smiling woman and a small boy with his father's serious eyes. Elias led her past the main room to a small door at the back of the cabin. He opened it. "This was my son's room," he said, his voice rough from disuse, the words feeling alien in his mouth. He didn't know why he told her that, only that it felt important to name the space, to honor the ghost that inhabited it. The room was simple, a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small wooden chest, and a single window looking out onto the endless plains. It was clean, preserved, a shrine to a life cut short. He placed the lantern on the chest, its light softening the starkness of the room. He pointed to the bed. Then he backed out of the room, pulling the door almost closed, leaving it open just a crack. A silent promise that she was not a prisoner. He had brought the wounded creature out of the wild, and now his silent, grieving house held a new and fragile life. That first night, sleep was a stranger to Elias. He lay in his own bed, the familiar lumps and hollows of the mattress offering no comfort. The house, his fortress of solitude, felt entirely different. It was no longer empty. The silence was not the dead, hollow silence of grief, but a living, breathing silence, punctuated by the imagined sounds of the girl in Samuel's room. He found himself listening, straining his ears for any sign of her. A cough, a sob, the creak of the bed springs as she shifted. There was nothing. She was as quiet as a ghost, a phantom of sorrow he had invited across his threshold. He pictured her in that small room, in Samuel's bed, surrounded by the lingering essence of a childhood she had likely never known. The thought was a dull ache in his chest. He rose from his bed and walked to the hearth, stoking the embers of the fire back to life. He sat in his worn armchair, the one Martha had always chided him for, and stared into the flames. The cabin was a museum of his loss. Every object held a memory, a sharp-edged piece of the life that had been stolen from him. The rocking chair in the corner where Martha had nursed their son. The small carved wooden horse on the mantelpiece that he had made for Samuel's 3rd birthday. He had locked these memories away, burying them under the hard-packed earth of his daily labor. But the girl's presence had disturbed the soil. Her profound, immediate suffering was a mirror to his own long-held, quiet despair. He felt the old guilt stirring, the relentless question that haunted his waking hours and stalked his dreams. Could he have done more? Could he have saved them? He had been away selling cattle when the fever had struck. He had returned to a nightmare, to a house filled with the scent of sickness and the terrifying silence of a wife too weak to speak, and a son whose breathing was a shallow, painful rasp. He had failed to protect them. The thought was a brand on his soul. Now there was another fragile life under his roof. A girl who looked as if a strong wind could tear her apart. A profound, almost paternal instinct, one he thought had been buried with his son, rose within him. It was a fierce, primitive urge to protect, to shield, to stand between her and whatever horrors had chased her into his barn. He did not know her name, her story, her crime. He knew only that she was afraid and alone, and that, for now, he was all she had. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in pale shades of gray and lavender, he rose from the chair. He moved to the kitchen, his actions quiet and deliberate. He prepared a simple breakfast, oatmeal with a drizzle of precious molasses and a cup of milk, still warm from the cow. He placed it all on a wooden tray and carried it to her door. He paused, listening. Still, there was no sound. He gently pushed the door open. She was asleep, or perhaps feigning it. She was curled on her side, facing the wall, the patchwork quilt pulled up to her chin. She looked impossibly small in the narrow bed, a lost child in a world too harsh for children. He set the tray down on the floor just inside the door, a silent offering to greet her when she woke. He retreated, closing the door as softly as he had opened it, leaving her to the privacy of her sorrow, and him to the unfamiliar weight of this new, shared silence. The days that followed fell into a slow, quiet rhythm, a silent dance of two solitary souls orbiting each other in the small universe of the ranch. Elias would rise before the sun, his movements as practiced and ingrained as a ritual. He would milk the cow, tend to the horses, and begin his work on the land, the vast, unforgiving expanse that demanded everything from a man and offered only survival in return. He would leave a tray of food, bread, cheese, a piece of fruit, whatever he had, on the floor outside her door before he left. When he returned at midday, the tray would be inside her room, the food gone, the plate and cup neatly stacked. He never saw her take it. He never heard her move. She was a phantom who subsisted on his charity, leaving only the faintest traces of her existence. He would work through the afternoon mending fences that stretched to the horizon, his thoughts a low hum of worry and a strange, unfamiliar flicker of something else. Curiosity, perhaps. When he came back to the cabin at dusk, smelling of dust and sweat and honest labor, he would find another small sign of her. A cup, washed and dried, placed carefully on the drain board by the sink, the blanket on his armchair, which he often left in a heap, folded with meticulous care. Once he found a tear in his work shirt left on a hook by the door, had been mended with tiny, almost invisible stitches, the thread a perfect match for the faded blue fabric. These small acts were her language, her only form of communication. They were whispers in the suffocating silence of the house, acknowledgments of his care, quiet thank yous offered from the shadows. He never acknowledged them directly. He would simply pick up the mended shirt or use the clean cup, incorporating her silent contributions into the fabric of his life. It was a delicate truce, a fragile ecosystem of trust being built on a foundation of shared space and unspoken needs. He did not push her. He did not knock on her door or demand her name. He understood, with an instinct born of his own deep grief, that she needed the sanctuary of her silence. Her wounds were not the kind that could be healed with words. They needed time and space, and the slow, steady balm of safety. He began to see more of her, though never directly. He would catch glimpses of her through the window as he worked near the cabin, a shadow passing behind the curtain, a brief flash of a pale face peering out before quickly retreating. She was like a wild deer, slowly acclimating to the presence of a human, learning that he was not a hunter. He started talking to his animals more, his voice a low rumble directed at his horse, Buck, or the placid milk cow. He spoke of the weather, of the work that needed doing. He knew somehow that she was listening from inside the house, that his voice, calm and steady, was a thread of sound she could cling to in the ocean of her fear. It was a way of speaking to her without speaking at her, a way of filling the silence with something other than sorrow. One afternoon he returned to the cabin to find the door to Samuel's room ajar. He froze, his heart giving a sudden sharp kick against his ribs. He peered inside. The room was empty. A wave of panic, cold and swift, washed over him. Had she left? Had she fled back into the wilderness that had so clearly tried to devour her? Then he saw her through the main room window. She was outside, standing by the small, neglected vegetable patch that Martha had once tended with such love. It was overgrown with weeds, the soil hard and cracked. The girl, he still didn't have a name for her, was standing at its edge, her back to him, her thin frame silhouetted against the afternoon sun. She was just looking at it, her head tilted as if listening to a story only she could hear. She wasn't running. She had stepped out of her cage, and her first destination was a place of dormant life, a place of potential. Elias watched her for a long moment, a strange warmth spreading through his chest, a feeling so foreign he couldn't immediately name it. It was hope. The breakthrough, when it came, was not born of words but of a shared instinctual language. A few days after he'd seen her by the dead garden, Elias was in the corral, working with a young colt that was proving to be more spirit than sin. The horse, a fiery chestnut with a wild eye, had tangled itself in a length of rope and in its panic had pulled a deep gash in its foreleg. Elias had managed to calm the animal enough to cut it free, but the wound was ugly, bleeding sluggishly and already beginning to swell. He was trying to clean it, his voice a low, soothing murmur, but the colt was skittish, dancing away from his touch, its fear making it unpredictable and dangerous. He was focused entirely on the horse, his brow furrowed in concentration, when a shadow fell over him. He looked up, startled. It was her. She had crossed the yard and was standing at the corral fence, her fingers curled around the rough wood of the top rail. Her eyes were not on him, but on the horse, and in them he saw not fear, but a deep, knowing empathy. She watched for a long moment as he struggled, his patience wearing thin as the horse shied away for the 10th time. Then, without a sound, she unlatched the gate and slipped inside the corral. Elias tensed, ready to order her back, to tell her it was too dangerous, but the word died on his lips. The way she moved was not the hesitant, fearful shuffle he was used to. There was a quiet confidence in her stride, a sureness that belied her fragile appearance. She approached the terrified colt not from the front, but from the side, moving in a slow, deliberate arc, never breaking eye contact. She began to hum. It was not a tune he recognized, but a low, melodic, wordless sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It was a sound of ancient calm, of deep peace. The colt's ears, which had been pinned back in agitation, twitched. They swiveled toward her, and its frantic dancing slowed. It watched her, its large dark eye filled with a wary curiosity. She continued to hum, her voice never wavering, and slowly, she reached out a hand. Her fingers, long and thin, did not go for the wound. They went to the horse's neck, stroking the tense muscle there with a touch so light it was barely there. The colt shuddered but stood its ground. It let out a long, whooshing sigh, the tension visibly draining from its powerful body. She murmured something to it in a language he didn't understand, the words soft and flowing like water over stones. Elias stood, frozen, a spectator to a miracle. He watched as she ran her hands over the horse's body, her touch both gentle and firm, calming its spirit. Only when the animal was completely still, its head lowered in trust, did she finally look at the gash on its leg. She glanced at Elias, then at the bucket of clean water and rags he had set down. It was a silent request. He moved as if in a trance, picking up the bucket and bringing it to her. He watched as she dipped a rag in the water and, with the same preternatural calm, began to clean the wound. The horse didn't even flinch. It stood as still as a statue, entranced by her quiet magic. In that moment, watching her tend to the wounded animal with a skill and gentleness that seemed innate, Elias saw her for the first time, not as the starving creature from his barn, not as a symbol of fragility, but as a person with a strength he could not comprehend, a hidden well of resilience and power, a healer. The silence between them was no longer one of fear and uncertainty. It was a silence of shared purpose, of mutual respect. He had offered her sanctuary, and she in return had just shown him the nature of her soul. Her emergence was like the slow, patient unfolding of a desert flower after a rare rain. The incident with the horse had broken a seal, not of silence, but of invisibility. She began to occupy the space of the ranch, not just inhabit it. She still spoke very little, her voice a rare and precious commodity, but her presence became a quiet constant. She took over the small dead garden by the porch with a fierce and gentle determination. Elias watched from a distance as she spent hours on her knees, her thin fingers working the hard, unforgiving soil. She pulled the stubborn weeds, her movements rhythmic and focused. She found his tools in the shed and used them to break up the compacted earth, her slight frame putting surprising strength into the work. She seemed to be coaxing the land back to life, whispering secrets to the dirt that only she knew. He found a new purpose in his trips to the distant town for supplies. He would buy seeds for her, beans and squash, carrots and herbs, leaving the small paper packets on the kitchen table without a word. The next day he would see new, neat rows in her expanding garden, the seeds carefully planted, the soil lovingly tended. It was her project, her claim on this small patch of the world. She began to bring life back into the cabin as well. She would find wildflowers on her walks, Indian paintbrush and wild blue flax, and place them in a tin cup on the windowsill, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the drab, dusty interior. She mended not just his shirts, but the threadbare curtains and the patchwork quilt in her own room. She was stitching the world back together, one small, careful repair at a time. Elias found himself watching her, his gaze lingering longer than it should. He watched the way the sun caught the new, clean sheen of her black hair as she worked in the garden. He watched the focused intensity on her face as she kneaded dough for bread, her hands no longer skeletal, now dusted with flour. He saw the life returning to her, filling out the hollows in her cheeks, putting a light back in her dark, expressive eyes. The cabin, once a tomb of memories, began to feel like a home again. The air, which had been thick with the ghosts of his past, now held the scent of baking bread, of fresh herbs, of the subtle, clean scent of the girl herself. His own grief, a constant, heavy cloak he had worn for 5 years, began to feel a little lighter. He was no longer just a man enduring his solitude. He was a man witnessing a resurrection. And in watching her come back to life, he felt the first stirrings of life within himself. He started fixing things he had let fall into disrepair: the sagging porch step, the sticky cabin door, the loose shutter that banged in the wind. He was not just maintaining his prison of sorrow anymore. He was improving a shared home. The silence between them remained for the most part, but it had transformed. It was no longer an empty, awkward void, but a comfortable, companionable quiet, filled with the hum of shared work and a growing, unspoken understanding. It was the quiet of two people who had found a strange, unexpected peace in each other's company, a quiet that was, in its own way, more intimate than any conversation. He was beginning to realize that in saving her, he might just be saving himself. The first true storm of the season broke the seal of silence. It rolled in from the west, a bruised purple mass of cloud that swallowed the blue sky whole. The wind picked up first, a low, mournful howl that rattled the windows and stripped the last stubborn leaves from the cottonwood trees. Elias, accustomed to the raw power of the plains, secured the barn and checked on the livestock, his movements efficient and calm. He returned to the cabin, just as the first fat drops of rain began to spatter against the roof, quickly escalating into a deafening roar. The sky tore open, and a torrent of water, hard as pebbles, hammered the world. He shut the door behind him, the sound of the storm instantly muffled, though its presence was an oppressive weight. He turned and saw her standing in the middle of the room, rigid as a fence post. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with a terror he had not seen since that first day in the barn. A brilliant flash of lightning lit the room in a stark blue-white glare, followed an instant later by a crack of thunder so loud it shook the very foundations of the cabin. A small choked cry escaped her lips and she flinched violently, her hands flying up to cover her ears. She was trembling, not with cold, but with a deep visceral fear that went beyond a simple storm. Elias understood immediately. The storm was not just a storm to her. It was a trigger, a key unlocking a door to a memory he could not see. He moved toward her, his instinct to comfort overriding the unwritten rules of their silent coexistence. Another flash of lightning, another deafening crash of thunder. She squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear tracing a clean path through the grime that still seemed to cling to her spirit. No matter how much she washed, she whispered a single word, a name perhaps, her voice a ragged, desperate sound. Nauvoo. It was a word from her own language, a sound both beautiful and broken. It hung in the air between them, a piece of her shattered world offered up in a moment of sheer terror. He stopped a few feet from her, not wanting to startle her further by touching her. He spoke, his voice low and steady, a rock in the raging sea of the storm. "You're safe," he said. The words were simple, direct. An anchor. "The storm can't get in here. The walls are strong." She opened her eyes, her gaze finding his. In the dim light of the lantern, he could see the raw panic swirling within them, but his voice, his calm presence, seemed to register. The trembling lessened, just slightly. "I'm here," he added, the two words carrying a weight of promise he hadn't intended, but felt with his entire being. "You're not alone." She stared at him, her breathing still shallow and fast. The thunder rumbled again, a long, low growl in the distance, and she flinched again, but this time it was less severe. She did not cry out. She kept her eyes locked on his, as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was coming apart. The storm raged on for another hour, a wild symphony of wind and water and celestial violence, and for that entire hour they stood in the center of the small cabin. Elias, a quiet, unmoving pillar of strength, and the girl slowly, painstakingly drawing on that strength, her fear receding with each passing rumble of thunder, until all that was left was the steady drumming of rain on the roof and a new, fragile kind of silence in the room. The seal was broken. He had heard her voice, a word from her soul, and he had answered. The world had changed. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, a new landscape emerged between them. The earth outside was washed clean, glistening and new, and inside the cabin, the atmosphere had undergone a similar cleansing. The fear that had been her constant shadow had receded, replaced by a tentative, fragile trust. The next day, as he was repairing a section of fence damaged by a fallen branch, she approached him, a cup of water in her hand. It was the first time she had sought him out in the open, a deliberate act of engagement. He took the cup, their fingers brushing for a fleeting second. The touch was like a spark on dry tinder, a jolt of awareness that ran up his arm. He looked at her and she held his gaze, her dark eyes clear and direct. "Thank you," she whispered. The words were soft, raspy from disuse, but they were in English, and they were for him. He just nodded, his own throat suddenly tight. "What is your name?" he asked, the question feeling momentous, as if he were asking for a sacred secret. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if remembering a part of herself she had long since buried. "Elara," she said. The name was like her voice, soft and melodic. It suited her. "Elara." "Elias," he replied, completing the exchange. It was a formal introduction in the middle of a muddy field, yet it felt more significant than any church wedding or signed contract. It was the moment they ceased to be a man and a girl, a rescuer and a victim, and became Elias and Elara. Over the next few days, she began to speak more, her words like shy creatures emerging from a long hibernation. Her English was broken, hesitant, pieced together from a life of listening on the fringes of towns like the one that had condemned her. She told him of her people, not in a single narrative, but in fragments, like pieces of a broken pot he had to assemble in his mind. They were travelers, she explained, the Nema, the people of the wind. They moved with the seasons, their knowledge not of property and fences, but of herbs and stars and the subtle language of the land. They were healers, midwives, menders of things broken. They were also outsiders, viewed with suspicion and fear by the settled folk in the towns they passed. She spoke of the town called Redemption. A sickness had come, a fever in the gut that spared no one. Her people had been camped nearby. They had tried to help, offering remedies of boiled willow bark and yarrow. But the sickness was in the water, a fact the town's preacher refused to acknowledge. It was easier to find a scapegoat. It was easier to blame the dark-haired strangers with their strange tongue and their quiet ways. She described the night the fear turned to rage, the night the men of redemption came with torches and accusations. Her voice faltered, the words catching in her throat. She didn't have to finish the story. He could see the rest of it in the haunted depths of her eyes, in the memory of the starving, terrified creature he had found huddled in his barn. He understood now the source of her terror during the storm. The thunder was the sound of the mob. The lightning was the flash of their torches. He had given her sanctuary from a storm of nature, but the storm she was truly running from was made of men. The sharing of stories became a currency of trust between them. Her fragmented history, offered like precious, painful gifts, invited his own. One evening, as they sat in the quiet companionship of the main room, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls, he saw her gaze fall upon the small, silver-framed photograph on the mantelpiece. She had glanced at it before, but had always looked away quickly, as if it were too private a shrine to gaze upon. Tonight, she looked at it with a soft, melancholy curiosity. Elias followed her gaze. The faces of his wife and son smiled out from the past, frozen in a moment of sunlight and happiness at a summer picnic. The silence in the room deepened, but it was a different kind of silence now, one that held a question. "Martha?" he said, his voice low. "And Samuel." He spoke their names aloud for the first time in her presence, and the act itself felt like a release, a lancing of a wound. Elara looked from the photograph to him, her expression full of a gentle, profound empathy. She did not offer empty platitudes or words of sorrow. She simply waited, giving him the space to continue if he chose. And he did. He found himself telling her, the words coming more easily than he would have thought possible. He spoke of Martha's laugh, which had been like the sound of a bubbling creek. He described her hands, always busy, always creating, quilts, gardens, a home. He spoke of Samuel, a quiet, serious boy with an insatiable curiosity about the world, a boy who would follow him for hours, asking endless questions about clouds and cattle and why the moon changed its shape. Then he told her of the end. He did not spare himself. He told her of his trip to sell cattle, of his foolish pride in getting a good price, of the days he was gone. He described his return, the unnatural quiet of the house, the sight of Martha, her face pale with fever, trying to smile for him, her strength already failing. He recounted the horror of finding Samuel burning with the same sickness, his small body struggling for every breath. He had been a capable man, a man who could tame a wild horse and build a house with his own 2 hands, but against the invisible enemy of the fever, he had been utterly helpless. He confessed the guilt that had been his constant companion ever since. "I wasn't here when it started," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I should have been here. I should have protected them." He had never spoken these words to another living soul. They were his secret shame, the failure that defined him. He finished, the story hanging in the quiet air of the cabin, raw and exposed. He felt stripped bare, vulnerable. He expected pity, perhaps, or an awkward silence. Instead, Elara reached out and placed her hand gently on his arm. Her touch was not one of pity, but of understanding. "It was not your failure," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It was their time. The spirits called them home. You cannot fight the spirits, Elias. You can only miss the ones they take." Her words, born of a different world, a different belief system, landed on him with a strange and unexpected grace. She was not trying to absolve him. She was simply stating a truth as she saw it. It was a truth that did not erase his pain, but it shifted its weight, making it, for the first time, seem possible to bear. In that moment, their shared grief became a bridge between them, a deep, powerful connection forged in the crucible of their respective losses. He had seen her scars, and now she had seen his. The next evening, she revealed a secret of her own. As the last light of day faded from the sky, she retrieved a small cloth-wrapped bundle from a hiding place within her room. She brought it to the main room, where Elias was cleaning his rifle, the familiar, methodical task a comfort in its predictability. She sat opposite him at the large wooden table and carefully unwrapped the cloth. Nestled in the folds was a small object, no bigger than her thumb. It was a bird, exquisitely carved from a piece of dark polished wood. Its wings were swept back as if in full flight, and its tiny, detailed head was lifted, its beak open in a silent, joyful song. It was a thing of simple, profound beauty. Elias put down his cleaning rag, his attention captured. The carving felt alive in her hands, imbued with a significance that went far beyond its physical form. "My father made this," Elara said, her voice soft with reverence. She ran her thumb over the smooth, worn wood. "It is a sky singer. He said it carries the spirit of our people. We do not build stone houses or draw lines on the land. Our home is the journey, the movement. Like the bird, we are not meant to be caged." She explained that every member of her family carried one, each carved from a different wood, each unique. It was their connection, their history, their identity, all held in the palm of a hand. "When they came," she said, her voice dropping, the memory still a shadow in her eyes, "the men from redemption, they took everything. Our wagons, our remedies, our blankets. They called our carvings devil's idols and threw them in the fire." She clenched her hand around the small bird, her knuckles white. "I hid this one. I could not let them burn my soul." Elias looked from the fierce protective look on her face to the tiny wooden bird. He understood. It was not just a carving. It was her resilience made manifest. It was the one piece of her identity, of her family, that the hatred of the world had not been able to touch. It was her defiance, her proof of existence. He saw the parallel with a sudden, aching clarity. He too had been caged. His cage was not made of iron bars, but of grief and guilt. A prison of his own making, built on this very land. He had stopped moving, stopped living, trapping himself with the ghosts of his past, and Elara, this sky singer in human form, had flown into his cage and was now, with her quiet strength and profound resilience, beginning to show him that the door was not locked. He thought of the posters he was sure were hanging in the town of Redemption, the bounty on the head of a witch. They had not just chased her, they were actively hunting her. They wanted to cage her, to destroy her spirit just as they had destroyed her family's camp. A cold, hard anger, an emotion he had not felt in years, began to smolder deep within him. It was a protective fire stoked by the sight of that small bird and the woman who held it, as if it were her own heart. He had failed to protect his family once before. He would not fail again. The world might see her as a vagrant, a witch, a problem to be erased, but he saw her now as she was, a sky singer. And his ranch, once a monument to death, would be her sky. He would not let them put her in a cage. Her knowledge of the natural world was a constant, quiet revelation. It was a deep, instinctual wisdom that went far beyond the simple planting of seeds. She saw the land not as a thing to be conquered and tamed as he did, but as a living entity, a complex web of relationships to be understood and respected. She would point out plants he had dismissed his entire life as weeds, telling him their names in her language and then in her broken English. "This one," she would explain, grinding its leaves between her fingers to release a pungent medicinal scent, "was good for fevers. That one, with the small yellow flower, could be made into a tea to soothe a troubled stomach." She was a walking library of ancient, practical knowledge. One afternoon, while splitting logs for the winter, the axe slipped, glancing off a knot in the wood and laying open a deep bleeding gush on his forearm. The pain was sharp and immediate, but it was the sight of the blood, his own blood, that unnerved him. He wrapped it hastily with a strip torn from his shirt, but it soaked through quickly. He stalked back to the cabin, cursing his own carelessness. Elara was there, and she saw the blood-soaked rag immediately. Her usual calm broke, her eyes widening with concern. Before he could protest that it was nothing, she took his arm with a gentle but firm grip and led him to the table. She unwrapped the crude bandage, her expression serious as she examined the clean, deep cut. "Wait," she commanded softly and disappeared out the cabin door. He sat there, feeling strangely helpless, watching the blood well up from the wound. She returned moments later, her hands full of broad green leaves he recognized as plantain, a common weed that grew everywhere. She chewed a few of the leaves into a green pulpy mass, a poultice, and without a trace of hesitation, applied it directly to the cut. It was cool and soothing against his hot skin. She then wrapped his arm with a clean strip of cloth, her movements efficient and practiced. "This will stop the bleeding," she said, her voice full of a quiet certainty. "It will keep the wound clean. No fever." He looked at her, at the focused intensity in her eyes, at her hands which were so sure in their healing purpose. He had lived on this land his entire life and had seen that plant 1,000,000 times, dismissing it as nothing. To her, it was medicine. It was life. Her touch lingered on his arm after she had tied the bandage. It was not a romantic touch, not yet, but it was profoundly intimate. It was the touch of a healer, a caregiver. It was the kind of touch he had not felt since Martha. A jolt went through him, a current of feeling so powerful and unexpected that it left him breathless. It was a complex mixture of gratitude, admiration, and something deeper, something warmer, something he was not yet ready to name. He was a man of action, of fences and cattle and the hard, physical realities of the world. She was a woman of spirit, of herbs and whispers and the unseen connections between things. They were as different as earth and sky. But here, in this quiet cabin, their two worlds were beginning to merge. He looked down at the green poultice beneath the bandage and then back at her face. He was beginning to understand that the deepest wounds were not always visible, and the most powerful healing did not always come from a doctor's bag. He had taken in a starving girl, and she in turn was healing him in ways he was only just beginning to comprehend. The cut on his arm would heal in a week. The wound on his soul, he realized, had already begun to mend. The fragile peace of their secluded world was destined to be broken. The need for supplies was a relentless tether to the society that existed beyond his fences. After several weeks, his stock of flour, salt, and coffee had dwindled to almost nothing. The trip to redemption was unavoidable. A knot of apprehension tightened in his gut at the thought. The town was no longer just a place of commerce, it was the source of Elara's terror, a nest of the very prejudice that had nearly destroyed her. He said nothing to her of his destination, only that he would be gone for the day. But she knew. He saw it in the way she watched him saddle his horse Buck, her eyes shadowed with a familiar fear. She stood on the porch as he prepared to leave, a silent, still figure. "Be careful, Elias," she whispered, and the simple words were laden with a world of meaning. The ride to redemption was tense. The familiar landscape seemed different, charged with a new menace. Every rock and tree seemed to be watching him. He felt like a man carrying a dangerous secret, which, he supposed, he was. As he rode down the town's wide, dusty main street, he felt the change immediately. The atmosphere was thick with a cloying, sanctimonious piety, mixed with a current of simmering fear. The faces of the people he passed were closed, their eyes suspicious. He tied Buck to the hitching post outside the general store and saw it. Nailed to the post, just below a notice for a town meeting, was a crude hand-drawn poster. It depicted a woman with wild, dark hair and demonic eyes, with the words, "Beware the Witch of the Nimini," scrawled beneath it. Below that, a smaller, more official-looking notice offered a reward of $50, a staggering sum, for any information leading to the capture of the woman responsible for bringing the devil's plague to their righteous town. The description was vague, but it was undeniably her. Elias felt a cold fury rise in him. He ripped the poster from the post, crumpling it into a tight ball in his fist. $50. They had put a price on her head, like she was a wolf to be hunted and skinned. He pushed open the door to the general store, the bell above it jangling nervously. The air inside was stale, smelling of pickles and hypocrisy. The storekeeper, a nervous man named Miller, stopped polishing the counter and eyed him warily. And then he saw the source of the town's poisoned atmosphere. Standing by the flour barrels, holding court with a small group of grim-faced men, was Reverend Blackwood. Blackwood was a tall, severe man with a face that looked like it had been carved from a sour apple. His eyes were small and black, glittering with a zealous fire that Elias recognized as the fire of a man who loved power more than God. He was the town's spiritual and practical authority, his sermons filled with fire and brimstone, his influence absolute. Blackwood's gaze fell upon Elias, and a slow, thin smile spread across his lips. "Elias Thorne," the Reverend said, his voice smooth and oiled like a well-kept gun. "We do not see you in town often." Preferring the solitude of your ranch, I presume, a man alone with his grief and his secrets. The words were a clear provocation, a baited hook cast into the still waters of Elias's stoicism. The other men looked at Elias, their expressions a mixture of suspicion and morbid curiosity. Elias met the Reverend's gaze, his own face an unreadable mask of stone. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this man was the architect of Elara's pain. This was the man who had twisted a town's fear into a lynch mob. The external threat was no longer an abstract concept. It had a name and a face, and it was staring right at him. Elias moved through the general store with a deliberate, unhurried grace that belied the storm raging inside him. He would not give Blackwood the satisfaction of a reaction. He nodded curtly to the storekeeper. "Miller, I need flour, salt, coffee beans, and a bag of sugar." His voice was low and even, the voice of a man conducting simple business. Miller scurried to fill his order, his movements jerky and nervous, clearly intimidated by the tense standoff between the town's preacher and its most solitary rancher. Reverend Blackwood was not so easily dismissed. He pushed himself away from the flour barrels and strolled toward Elias, his boots echoing on the worn floorboards. He stopped beside him, close enough that Elias could smell the scent of cheap bay rum and self-righteousness. "A man needs more than flour and salt to sustain him, Thorne," Blackwood said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "He needs a community. He needs the word of the Lord to protect him from the evils that wander this world, evils that can take the form of sickness or of a tempting serpent in a woman's guise." The insinuation was as sharp and clear as a shard of glass. He knew, or he suspected, perhaps one of the men who had chased Elara from the camp had seen her flee in the direction of his ranch. Perhaps it was just a fisherman's cast, a random probing of the defenses of a man who kept to himself. Either way, the danger was palpable. Elias turned his head slowly to look at the Reverend, his gaze as cold and flat as a frozen lake. "I find the Lord speaks loudest in the silence of the plains, Reverend," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a hard edge. "And I've had my fill of serpents. They tend to wear collars and stand in pulpits, telling other men what to fear." A collective gasp went through the small group of onlookers. No one spoke to Reverend Blackwood that way. The preacher's thin smile tightened, the skin around his eyes crinkling. The mask of piety slipped for a second, revealing the raw ambition and anger beneath. "Pride is a sin, Mr. Thorne," Blackwood hissed. "It goes before the fall. This town is a godly town. We purged a great evil from our midst, a heathen witch who brought a plague upon our children. We will not suffer her kind or those who shelter them to poison us again." He was no longer probing, he was declaring war. Elias paid Miller for his supplies, his movements economical and precise. He loaded the heavy sacks into the canvas bag slung over his shoulder, his back to the Reverend. He could feel the man's eyes on him, burning with righteous fury. As he turned to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at Blackwood, his expression grim. "Be careful what you hunt, Reverend," Elias said, his voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the thick silence of the store. "Sometimes the thing in the darkness is just a reflection of the man holding the torch." He walked out of the store without another word, leaving a stunned, simmering silence in his wake. The ride home was a blur of grim determination. The sanctuary he had built for Elara was no longer a secret. It was a target, The quiet life they had begun to forge was balanced on the edge of a knife. The world, with all its ignorance and hatred, was coming for them. He was no longer just a man offering shelter. He was now a guardian, a protector, standing against the tide. The weight of it settled on his shoulders, familiar and heavy, but this time, it was a weight he chose to bear. He returned to the ranch under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The setting sun cast long, ominous shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the land. The cabin, with a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney, looked small and vulnerable against the vast, darkening plains. Elara was waiting on the porch, just as she had been when he left. She saw the look on his face the moment he rode into the yard, and the hope that had begun to blossom in her eyes withered. She knew she didn't need him to say a word. He dismounted, his movements stiff, and began to unload the supplies. She came down the steps to help him, her silence a question he did not yet know how to answer. They worked together, carrying the sacks of flour and sugar into the cabin, the familiar domestic task feeling surreal and charged with unspoken tension. Inside, the fire she had kept going cast a warm, welcoming glow, a stark contrast to the cold dread that filled the room. The fragile peace they had so carefully constructed had been shattered. The sanctuary now felt like a fortress under siege. Elias didn't tell her right away. He couldn't bring himself to put the ugliness of the town into words. Not yet. He didn't want to see that specific, hunted terror return to her eyes. So he moved through the evening chores in a state of grim preoccupation, his mind racing. He checked the locks on the doors, the latches on the windows. He cleaned his rifle again, this time not as a routine task but as a preparation. His solitude had been his shield for 5 years, but now it was a liability. He was one man against a town whipped into a frenzy by a zealot. Elara watched him, her quiet presence a constant worried question. She did not press him, did not pry. She simply moved around him, giving him space, her empathy a palpable thing in the room. She prepared a simple meal of bread and cheese, and they ate in a silence that was heavier and more freighted with meaning than any they had yet shared. The comfortable quiet was gone, replaced by the tense silence of a coming battle. After they ate, he stood by the window, looking out into the impenetrable darkness. The world beyond his small circle of lantern light was full of imagined threats. He saw torches in the distance, heard the sound of approaching horses. He was on edge, every nerve taut. Elara came to stand beside him, her shoulder almost brushing his. "You saw something in the town," she stated, her voice soft. It wasn't a question. "They are still looking for me." "Yes," he said, the word a hard pebble in his throat. "There's a poster, a bounty." He felt her stiffen beside him, a small, sharp intake of breath. He had tried to shield her from it, but the truth was a poison that had to come out. He turned to face her, the lantern light carving shadows on her anxious face. "They call you a witch. They blame you for the sickness." "I know," she whispered, her gaze dropping to the floor. "It is what they do. They fear what they do not understand, and they destroy what they fear." He saw the resignation in her posture, the old, familiar posture of a victim, and it ignited a spark of defiance in him. "No," he said, his voice firm, reaching out to gently cup her chin, lifting her face so she had to meet his eyes. "Not here. This is your home now. They will not touch you." His words were a vow, a declaration made to her and to the ghosts of his own past failures. In that moment, he was no longer just a man hiding from his grief. He was a man with a purpose, a fierce, burning reason to fight. He would not let the darkness of the world extinguish this small, brave light. The sanctuary might be fragile, but he would be its unbreaking wall. The following days were heavy with a watchful tension. The ranch, once a haven of peace, now felt like the calm at the center of a gathering storm. Elias worked with a new, grim intensity, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his ears attuned to any sound that was out of place. He was preparing for a war he hoped would never come. But the first shot was fired not with a bullet, but with the arrival of a lone rider. He appeared late one afternoon, a silhouette against the glaring western sun, his horse moving at a lazy, confident pace. He was not a townsman. He had the lean, hungry look of a man who lived in the saddle, a man who made his living from the troubles of others. A bounty hunter, Elias saw him from the barn, and his hand immediately went to the pistol holstered at his hip. He walked out to meet the rider in the open yard, positioning himself between the stranger and the cabin, a silent human shield. The man drew his horse to a halt, his eyes small and shrewd, taking in the ranch with a practiced, assessing gaze. He was dressed in worn leather, a dusty hat pulled low over his face. "Afternoon," the rider said, his voice a dry rasp. "Just passing through. Wondered if you'd seen anything. Unusual. A woman, on her own. Dark hair. Might look a bit lost." He said it casually as if making idle conversation, but his eyes never stopped moving, scanning the cabin, the windows, searching for any sign of life within. Elias stood his ground, his expression unreadable, his body language a wall of quiet hostility. "The only thing I've seen out here is my own cattle," he replied, his voice flat and cold. "And they're all accounted for. This is private land." The bounty hunter let out a short, humorless laugh. "Private land, sure. But the whole territory is buzzing about this witch from Redemption. $50 for her. Man could do a lot with $50. He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping conspiratorially. "I'd even be willing to split it if a man was to say, find her holed up in his barn." The directness of the threat was a slap in the face. This was Blackwood's doing. The Reverend had clearly spread the word that Thorne was the man to watch. The bounty hunter was a probe, sent to test his defenses, to see if the rumor had substance. "There's no one here," Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "And there's no $50 for you on this ranch. The only thing you'll find here is trouble if you don't turn that horse around and ride back the way you came." The air crackled with tension. For a long moment the two men stared at each other, a silent battle of wills. The bounty hunter's gaze flickered from Elias's cold, hard eyes to the worn handle of the pistol at his hip. He was a predator, but he was also a pragmatist. He weighed the potential reward against the certain risk of confronting a man like Elias on his own ground. Elias did not move, did not even blink. He was a mountain of quiet menace, immovable and absolute. Finally, with a dismissive sneer, the bounty hunter pulled on his reins. "Have it your way, rancher," he spat. "But they'll find her. A creature like that can't hide forever, and when they do, anyone who helped her will have to answer to the Reverend." He wheeled his horse around and kicked it into a canter, riding off without a backward glance, leaving a trail of dust and a cloud of palpable threat hanging in the air. Elias watched until he was just a small speck on the horizon. The probe was over. The threat was no longer at their doorstep. It had just kicked the door in. He knew with a grim certainty that the time for hiding was over. The bounty hunter would report back to Blackwood, and the next visitors to the ranch would not be so easily dismissed. The departure of the bounty hunter was a catalyst. The illusion of safety, already thin, was now completely gone. Hiding was no longer a strategy. It was a slow, inevitable defeat. Elias knew what he had to do. The fight could not be won here, on his isolated ranch. The poison was in the town, and it had to be confronted at its source. That evening, he sat with Elara at the kitchen table. The simple meal of soup and bread sat untouched between them. The air was thick with the unsaid. He had to tell her his plan, and he dreaded it. He was about to ask her to walk back into the heart of her own nightmare. "He will tell the Reverend," Elias said, breaking the silence. "The bounty hunter. He will tell him I have nothing to hide, but Blackwood won't believe him. He'll use it as proof. He'll bring others." Elara stared down at her hands, which were clenched in her lap. "I will leave," she whispered, the words costing her everything. "I will not bring this trouble to you, Elias. You have done too much for me already." "No," he said, his voice sharp, absolute. He reached across the table, covering her clenched hands with his own. Her skin was cold. "You are not leaving. This is your home. Your fight is now my fight." He took a deep breath, the words forming slowly, weighed with the gravity of his decision. "We can't wait for them to come to us. We have to go to them. We ride into Redemption. Together." Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and sheer terror. "No," she breathed. "I cannot. They will tear me apart." "They will not touch you," he said, his grip on her hands tightening, willing his own strength into her. "You will be by my side. I will not let them harm you." He could see the storm of fear in her eyes, the memories of the torches and the angry faces. He was asking the impossible, asking a burn victim to walk back into the fire. "Elara, listen to me," he said, his voice earnest, compelling. "Fear is what Blackwood uses. It's his weapon. He's made you into a monster, a ghost story to scare his people into obedience. The only way to fight a ghost is to turn on the lights. They need to see you, not the witch from their stories, but you, the woman who healed my horse, the woman who can make a garden grow from dead earth, the woman who mended my shirt." He leaned closer, his gaze intense. "I know I am asking for more courage than any person should have to possess, but your people, the Nema, you said they were not meant to be caged. Blackwood has put you in a cage of fear. Hiding here is just another cage. We have to break it, together." He laid his heart bare, his belief in her a shield he offered against her terror. He asked her to trust him, not just with her life, but with her spirit, the very thing she had fought so hard to protect. He watched the war playing out on her face, the instinct to flee warring with the flicker of defiance he had nurtured in her. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the frantic beating of his own heart. Finally, she took a shaky breath and, slowly, deliberately, nodded her head. It was the bravest act he had ever witnessed. The journey into redemption was a descent into a shared crucible. They rode side by side, Elias on his sturdy horse Buck, and Elara on the gentle mare she had healed, her posture a testament to a courage summoned from the deepest well of her spirit. She was dressed not in the rags he had found her in, but in a simple, clean dress he had bought for her on a previous trip to a different town, a dress the color of the evening sky. Her black hair was clean and braided, a stark contrast to the wild image on Blackwood's posters. She looked not like a witch, but like a woman of quiet dignity. As they neared the town, the familiar landscape began to feel hostile. The air grew thick with a sense of judgment. Elias could feel Elara's tension beside him, a palpable vibration of fear. He reached over, his rough, calloused hand briefly covering her own where it rested on the saddle horn. "I am with you," he murmured, a simple promise that was the bedrock of their mission. Riding down the main street was like running a gauntlet. The town went unnaturally quiet as they appeared. Faces appeared in windows. People stopped in the street to stare, their expressions ranging from slack-jawed shock to open hostility. Whispers followed them like a swarm of angry bees. "It's her, the witch. And Thorn, he's with her." Elias kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, his face a mask of resolute calm, but he was aware of every stare, every muttered curse. He could feel Elara shrinking in the saddle, the force of the town's collective hatred a physical blow. He moved his horse closer to hers, their legs almost touching, creating a small, mobile fortress of two. He was her shield, absorbing the venom of the crowd so it would not strike her directly. He led them to the hitching post outside the general store, the very heart of the town, the place where he had confronted Blackwood. He dismounted with a slow, deliberate motion, then turned to help Elara down. As her feet touched the ground, she swayed, her face pale. For a moment he thought she might collapse. He kept a steadying hand on her arm, his presence a solid anchor in the sea of malice. "Stay close," he whispered. "Look at me, not them." They turned to face the store, and as if on cue, the door swung open. Reverend Blackwood stood there, flanked by two of his most loyal and brutish followers, a pair of brothers known more for their muscle than their minds. Blackwood's face was a mask of triumphant fury. He had not expected this. He had expected to hunt the witch down in her hiding place, to drag her back in chains. He had not expected her to walk willingly into his domain. "Well, well," the Reverend boomed, his voice carrying across the silent street, ensuring everyone was a witness. "The serpent slithers out of its hole and brings its new pet with it. Elias Thorn, you have brought a curse into our town. You have sheltered the devil's own bride." Elias flinched at the words, a small involuntary shudder. Elias's grip on her arm tightened, not in restraint but in reassurance. The confrontation had begun. The line was drawn in the dust of the main street, and the entire town of Redemption had gathered to watch. Reverend Blackwood took a step forward, his black coat flapping around him like the wings of a crow. He pointed a long, accusatory finger at Elara, his voice ringing with theatrical righteousness. "This woman, this vagrant, she came to our town with her heathen ways and brought a plague that struck down our innocent children. She is a witch, a servant of darkness, and the Lord's justice demands she be purged." A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled crowd. They were a flock, and Blackwood was their shepherd, guiding them with a crook of fear. Elara trembled, her eyes fixed on the ground, the weight of their hatred pressing down on her. Elias felt a surge of cold, protective anger. He stepped forward slightly, placing himself partially in front of her, a living barrier. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The quiet intensity of his words cut through the Reverend's bluster like a knife. "This woman's name is Elara," he said, his voice low and steady, yet it carried to every corner of the silent street. "She is not a witch. She is a healer." A scoffing laugh came from Blackwood. "A healer? She brought death. Ask the Millers, whose son still coughs his lungs out. Ask the Davidsons, who buried their little girl." The crowd grew more agitated, their fear stoked by the Reverend's words. Elias stood his ground, his gaze never leaving Blackwood's. "The sickness came from the creek south of town," Elias stated, his voice ringing with unshakable conviction. "The one your cattle drink from, Reverend. The one you told everyone was clean, even after the Nema warned you it was tainted." A gasp went through the crowd. This was a new story, a different narrative than the one they had been fed. Blackwood's face flushed a dark mottled red. "Lies! Slander from a godless man and his heathen whore," he roared, losing his composure for a moment. But Elias was relentless. He turned his gaze from the preacher to the townsfolk, addressing them directly, his voice earnest and clear. "I have known only solitude and grief for 5 years. My heart was as dead and barren as the winter ground. This woman, Elara, came to my home, starving and terrified, hunted by you for a crime she did not commit. And what did this witch do?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air. "She healed my horse when it was injured. She mended my clothes. She took a patch of dead earth by my porch and brought it back to life." He looked directly at Mrs. Miller, the storekeeper's wife, who was weeping in the crowd. "She knows more about healing herbs than any doctor you'll find in this territory. The cough your son has, it is from the damp in your house, not a curse. There are roots that can soothe it, roots Elara could show you how to find." He then turned his steely gaze back to the fuming Reverend. "You speak of God, but you use his name to feed your own power. You needed a monster to make yourself a savior. You needed someone to blame so you wouldn't have to admit your own pride, your own failure to listen. You say she is a curse. I say she is a blessing, and she is under my protection. If you want her," he finished, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet, "you will have to come through me." He stood there, a solitary man of decency against a tide of ignorance, his public declaration of protection for Elara echoing in the stunned silence of the street. He had not just defended her, he had challenged the very foundation of Blackwood's power. The standoff in the street held for a long, breathless moment. Elias's words, spoken with such quiet conviction, had planted a seed of doubt in the crowd. They looked from Elias's stony, resolute face to the Reverend's sputtering rage, and for the first time some of them seemed to be questioning the narrative they had been given. Blackwood, seeing his authority challenged, knew he had to regain control. "He is bewitched!" the Reverend shrieked, his voice cracking with fury. "She has clouded his mind with her dark arts. Do not listen to him. Seize the witch." He gestured to the 2 brutish men beside him, but even they hesitated, unnerved by Elias's unwavering calm. Sensing the tide was turning, even if only slightly, Elias knew it was time to leave. He had said what he came to say. He had shown them Elara, and he had shown them that he would stand for her. He placed a hand on Elara's back, a firm, reassuring pressure. "We're going home," he murmured. He turned them both toward their horses, moving with a deliberate lack of haste that was, in itself, an act of defiance. He would not be chased away. The crowd parted for them, a confused, uncertain sea of faces. They had come for a public condemnation, a spectacle of righteous fury. They had gotten a lesson in courage, and a story that contradicted their deepest fears. Elias helped Elara onto her mare, then swung himself into Buck's saddle. For a moment he looked back at the crowd, his gaze sweeping over them, finally landing on Reverend Blackwood. The preacher's face was a mask of pure hatred, his plans for an easy victory thwarted. The look that passed between the 2 men was a silent promise of future conflict. This was not over. It was only the end of the beginning. They rode out of town the same way they had come in, but the atmosphere was different. The hostile stares were now tinged with confusion, with grudging respect, with doubt. They had walked into the lion's den, and the lion had blinked. As soon as the last buildings of redemption were behind them, some of the tension drained from Elara's body. She slumped in the saddle, the adrenaline that had held her upright deserting her. Elias rode close beside her, his presence a silent comfort. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. There was nothing left to say. The lines had been drawn. They had publicly declared their allegiance to each other, their small unit of two against a world of prejudice. When they reached the familiar side of the cabin and the barn, it no longer felt like a fortress under siege. It felt like a true sanctuary, a place they had fought for and earned. They unsaddled the horses in the barn, the familiar, comforting sense of hay and leather a balm to their frayed nerves. The act of returning to their routine of caring for the animals was grounding. It reestablished the simple, honest rhythm of their life together. That night, as they prepared to retreat to their separate rooms, the bond between them felt stronger than ever, forged anew in the fire of their shared defiance. They had faced the town together. They knew now that whatever came next, they would face that together too. The ranch was their island, and they were its sole inhabitants, waiting for the inevitable tide of Blackwood's vengeance to crash upon their shores. In the quiet days that followed their trip to town, a new intimacy blossomed in the spaces between their words. The shared danger had burned away the last vestiges of awkwardness, leaving a deep and profound connection. They had stood together against the world, and in doing so had created a world entirely their own. It was in this fragile, charged peace that the final walls around their hearts began to crumble. One evening, as a chill wind howled outside, they sat by the fire, the flames casting a warm, flickering glow on their faces. The air was thick with unspoken emotions, with the things that had been stirred up by their confrontation with Blackwood. Elias, who had carried his own grief like a shroud for so long, felt compelled to finally share the whole of it, to lay his deepest wound bare. "He was 5, Elias began, his voice rough, his gaze fixed on the flames, as if he could see the past in them. "Samuel, he was just 5 years old." He told her the full story this time, not just the facts of the fever, but the texture of the loss. He spoke of the suffocating helplessness of watching his son's vibrant life flicker and fade, of the terrible silence that fell after his last, shallow breath. He confessed his deepest, most irrational guilt, that in the days leading up to the sickness he had been short-tempered with the boy, weary from work, and had snapped at him for some minor childhood transgression. "The last thing I said to him, it was a sharp word," Elias whispered, the confession of physical pain in his chest. "I left for that trip without making it right. I never got to tell him I was sorry. I never got to hold him one last time and tell him he was a good boy." The tears he had held back for 5 years finally welled in his eyes, hot and sharp. He did not weep, but the moisture glistened, a testament to a grief that had never been allowed to breathe. He felt a profound shame in his weakness, in exposing this raw, broken part of himself. He expected silence, perhaps discomfort. Instead, Elara moved from her chair to sit on the floor at his feet. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a wisdom that seemed ancient. "My mother taught me that words are like seeds," she said softly. "A sharp word can be a stone, it is true, but the love you gave him for 5 years, that was a forest. A single stone cannot kill a forest, Elias. His spirit knew your heart. It still does." Then she offered him a truth of her own, a piece of her story she had held back. "The sickness and redemption," she began, her voice low and steady. "It was from the tainted well. I knew it was. My grandfather taught me how to read the water, to see the signs of poison. I told the Reverend. I went to him, to his church, and I told him the well behind the tannery was bad, that people must not drink from it. He called me a blasphemer. He said the town's water was blessed by God and that I was trying to spread fear." She looked down at her hands. He knew, and he let his pride poison his people. And when they started to die, it was easier to blame the woman who told him the truth than to admit his own sin. That is the man who hunts me, not a man of God, but a man terrified of his own shadow. The confession hung in the air, a stunning revelation. It was not just ignorance that drove Blackwood, it was a deliberate, prideful act of evil. He had knowingly sacrificed his own people to protect his authority. Elias looked at her, at the quiet strength it took to carry such a truth. Their pains were different, but they came from the same source, a world that was cruel and unjust and often made no sense. He reached down, his calloused hand finding hers. He laced his fingers through hers, a simple, powerful gesture of union. In that moment, they were not just a protector and the protected. They were equals, two scarred survivors who had found in each other a reason to face the coming darkness. The darkness came as they knew it would. It came on a moonless night under a sky choked with clouds. Elias was woken from a light, uneasy sleep not by a sound, but by a change in the atmosphere, a primal sense of being watched. He rose from his bed, pulling on his trousers and grabbing the rifle that was always propped by his door. He moved to the window and peered out into the inky blackness. At first he saw nothing, then a flicker of light on the horizon, then another, and another, a line of torches, like angry, bobbing fireflies moving steadily across the plains toward his ranch. It was Blackwood. He had brought his mob. A cold, calm certainty settled over Elias. The time for waiting was over. He moved quickly to Elara's door and knocked softly. "They're here," was all he said. The door opened immediately. She was already dressed, her face pale but her eyes resolute. She had been waiting too. "The horses," she said, her voice steady. "We should run." "No," Elias replied, his voice firm. "There's nowhere to run where they won't follow. This is our home. We make our stand here." The decision was absolute. To run now would be to undo everything they had fought for. It would be to admit guilt, to let Blackwood win. He moved through the small cabin with purpose, extinguishing the main lantern, leaving only the low glow from the hearth. He checked the load of his rifle, his movements sure and practiced. Elara did not argue. She seemed to draw strength from his resolve. She moved to the kitchen and returned with a heavy iron skillet, its weight a meager but defiant comfort in her hands. They stood together in the darkened main room, listening as the sound of hoofbeats grew from a distant rumble to a thunderous roar. The torches drew closer, casting wild, dancing shadows that turned the familiar landscape outside into a hellish tableau. The riders surrounded the cabin, their dark shapes illuminated by the flickering, demonic light of the torches they carried. "Elias Thorne!" Reverend Blackwood's voice boomed through the night, magnified by the unnatural quiet. "You have harbored a witch. You have defied the will of God and this community. Cast her out now, and we may yet show you mercy." Elias moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the curtains. He could see at least a dozen men, their faces grim and set in the torchlight, their rifles glinting. They were not just a mob anymore. They were an army, fueled by fear and righteousness. "He offers the mercy of a wolf," Elias muttered, his hand tightening on his rifle. He looked at Elara, who stood near the hearth, the iron skillet held in front of her like a shield. The terror was in her eyes, but beneath it was a core of steel he had never seen before. She was not the cowering creature from the barn. She was a woman ready to defend her home. The final confrontation had begun. The small, lonely cabin had become the last bastion of decency in a world gone mad, and its two inhabitants would not let it fall without a fight. The siege began with a splintering crash. A rock thrown from the darkness shattered the front window, spraying glass across the floorboards. The sound broke the tense silence, a declaration of war. Elara gasped, but she did not scream. Elias didn't flinch. He raised his rifle, aimed carefully through the broken window, and fired not at a man, but into the ground just in front of the mob's horses. The crack of the rifle shot was a sharp, definitive answer to their violence. The horses shied and reared, their riders cursing as they fought to control them. It was a warning shot, a statement that this house would shoot back. "Hold your ground, man," Blackwood bellowed, his voice straining to project confidence. "He is one man. We are the righteous hand of the Lord." Another shot rang out, this time from the mob. The bullet thudded into the thick log wall of the cabin, inches from where Elias stood. The battle was joined. Elias was a capable man, and this was his land, his home. He knew every angle, every shadow. He moved from the front window to the small side window in the kitchen, never giving them a stationary target. He did not aim to kill, he aimed to intimidate, to wound, to break their nerve. He fired another shot, and one of the men cried out, clutching a fleshy wound in his shoulder. The man stumbled back, his bravado gone, replaced by the raw shock of pain. Elara was not idle. Her fear, a cold, paralyzing thing, had been burned away by a hot, fierce resolve. She was not a warrior, but she would not be a passive victim. As Elias fired and reloaded, she was there, a shadow at his side. She had his spare ammunition laid out on the table. When he emptied a rifle, she was there to press the cool, heavy weight of the reloaded one into his hands. Her movements were swift and sure. At one point, a stray bullet ricocheted through the open window frame, grazing Elias's temple. The blow staggered him, blood instantly welling and streaming down his face, blurring his vision. He cursed, stumbling back. Before he could even register the pain, Elara was there. She tore a strip from her own dress and pressed it firmly against the wound, her touch gentle but firm. "Hold still," she commanded, her voice steady despite the chaos. She cleaned the wound with a splash of whiskey from a bottle on the shelf, the sting making him hiss. She then tied the bandage tightly around his head. Her face, illuminated by the firelight and the hellish glow from outside, was a mask of fierce concentration. In that moment, as she tended to his wound in the middle of a firefight, their roles were perfectly defined. He was the shield, the physical defender. She was the heart, the healer, the one who sustained him. They were a single, functioning unit, their movements synchronized, their purpose unified. Outside, the mob was growing more frustrated. Their initial confidence was being chipped away by the stubborn, effective defense of the lone rancher. They were taking injuries, and their righteous anger was beginning to be replaced by a more primal fear. Blackwood, seeing his control slipping, grew more desperate. "He will not drive us back," he screamed, his voice hoarse with rage. "The witch has made him her fortress, then we shall burn the fortress down, burn the barn, smoke them out." A new, more terrible phase of the battle was about to begin. The fight for the house was one thing, but the barn was where it had all started. It was the symbol of their sanctuary. The orange glow of the torches moved toward the barn. Elias saw it from the window, a knot of cold dread tightening in his stomach. The barn was more than just a building. It was a tinderbox of dry hay and old wood. It was where he had found her. It was the cradle of their new life. To burn it was not just a tactic, it was an act of profound violation. "No," he breathed, a wave of desperate fury washing over him. He raised his rifle, but the men were using the structure of the barn itself as a shield. He couldn't get a clear shot. "Elias, what is it?" Elara asked, seeing the look on his face. "They're going for the barn," he said, his voice grim. The first torch was thrown. It landed on the roof, sputtering for a moment before the dry shingles caught, a small tongue of flame licking up into the night. Another torch followed, landing in the hay pile just inside the open door. The hay ignited with a terrifying whoosh, and in seconds the interior of the barn was a roaring inferno. The light from the fire was immense, brighter than any day, casting the entire ranch in a hellish, flickering orange light. The heat was a physical presence, felt even from inside the cabin. Elara cried out, a sound of pure anguish. The fire was a visceral echo of the mob that had burned her family's camp, a terrifying reenactment of her deepest trauma. She stumbled back from the window, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Elias felt a surge of rage so powerful it was almost blinding. The fire was not just an attack on him, it was a direct assault on her spirit. "Surrender the witch, Thorn!" Blackwood's voice roared over the crackle of the flames, triumphant and cruel. "Or you will burn with her." In that moment, Elias knew that bullets would not win this fight. His defense of the cabin had been effective, but it couldn't stop this. Blackwood wasn't just trying to capture Elara anymore. He was trying to destroy everything, to salt the earth of their small world. He had to break the spell Blackwood held over these men. He had to fight not their bodies, but their minds. And as he stared into the swirling vortex of flame and hatred, he realized he had one last desperate card to play. But he wouldn't be the one to play it. As the flames climbed higher, illuminating the faces of the men in the mob, a flicker of movement near the back of the crowd caught Elias's eye. It was a man named Jebediah, a simple farmer whose small plot of land bordered redemption. Elias had seen him in town, a quiet man who usually kept to himself. But there was something else. A memory surfaced in Elias's mind. A brief, fragmented story Elara had told him weeks ago. about a sick child she had encountered on the road, a child with a croupy cough and a frightened father. She had given the man a small bundle of mullein leaves and told him how to make a tea. She had never known his name, but Elias, looking at the man's tormented face bathed in the firelight, suddenly knew. It was Jebediah, and his child was the one she had helped. The fire raged, consuming the barn with a hungry roar, its light a pulsating, malevolent heart in the center of the yard. The heat was intense, the air thick with the smell of burning hay and pine. Inside the cabin, the light flickered across Elara's face, showing the raw terror in her eyes. But as she watched the symbol of her first sanctuary burn, something inside her shifted. The fear remained, a cold stone in her gut, but a new feeling rose to meet it, a defiant anger. This was her home they were destroying. This was her life they were trying to extinguish. She would not let them. She looked at Elias, at the grim line of his jaw, at the blood-soaked bandage on his head. She saw his exhaustion, his desperation. She knew he could not hold them off forever. The battle had to change. Outside, Jebediah the farmer stood at the edge of the mob, his rifle held loosely in his hands. He watched the flames devour the barn, and a profound sickness filled him. He had come here tonight, swept up in the Reverend's fiery rhetoric, his own fears about the sickness that had swept the town twisted into a weapon against the outsider. But looking at the inferno, he did not feel righteous. He felt ashamed. He thought of his daughter, Sarah, and her terrible barking cough that had kept them both awake for nights on end. He remembered the dark-haired woman on the road, a stranger, who had looked at his child not with fear or disgust, but with a gentle, knowing compassion. She had not asked for payment. She had simply offered help. Her remedy of mullein tea had worked. Sarah's cough had eased. Her fever had broken. He had told no one, afraid of the Reverend's condemnation, afraid of being associated with the witch. Now, that same woman was trapped in the cabin, and he was part of the mob that had come to drag her out. The hypocrisy of it burned hotter than the fire. He saw Reverend Blackwood, his face ecstatic in the firelight, a prophet presiding over a sacrifice. He saw the other men, their faces a mixture of fear and bloodlust, and he knew he could not be a part of it any longer. Stop. Jebediah's voice was not loud, but it cut through the noise of the fire and the mob's fervor with the sharp edge of conviction. This is wrong. Heads turned. Reverend Blackwood spun around, his expression turning from triumph to fury. "What did you say, Brother Jebediah? Has the devil's magic touched you as well?" "It wasn't her," Jebediah said, taking a step forward, his voice gaining strength. "The witch. She's no witch. The sickness? My Sarah had it. I met this woman on the road. She didn't curse us. She helped us. She gave me herbs, told me how to make a tea. She saved my daughter." A stunned silence fell over the mob. They all knew Jebediah. They knew his daughter had been sick. This was not the word of a bewitched rancher protecting his stolen woman. This was the testimony of one of their own. The certainty of the mob began to fracture. They looked at each other, their righteous anger wavering, replaced by a dawning confusion. Inside the cabin, Elias heard it. He saw the shift in the crowd. It was the crack in the armor he had been praying for. The spell was beginning to break. Elias seized the moment. The mob's conviction was fractured, their unity broken by Jebediah's testimony. Now was the time to press the advantage, not with bullets, but with the one weapon Reverend Blackwood could not defend against: the truth. He handed his rifle to Elara. "Stay back from the door," he commanded. Before she could protest, he unbolted the heavy cabin door and stepped outside, unarmed, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. He walked forward into the hellish light of the burning barn, a solitary, blood-stained figure standing between the mob and the cabin. "Enough!" His voice rang out, raw and powerful, commanding attention. He was not shouting, but his voice carried the weight of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to defend. The men quieted, their attention shifting from the wavering Jebediah to this new, startling development. Blackwood's face was a thunderous mask of rage. "Fool! You come out to die?" Elias ignored him, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the townsmen, the farmers, the men he knew by sight if not by name. "Jebediah speaks the truth," Elias said, his voice resonating with sincerity. "Elara is a healer, but you don't have to take his word for it. You can take mine, or you can use the sense God gave you." He pointed not at Blackwood, but toward the south, in the direction of the town. The sickness started after the spring floods, didn't it? And it was worse for the families living downstream from the old tannery. From the well Blackwood told you was pure. He fixed his eyes on one of the men, a tanner named Silas. Your family was hit the worst, Silas. Your well is 50 yards from the tannery creek. Coincidence? He then turned his gaze on Blackwood, the full force of his righteous anger finally unleashed. This man is not your savior, he is your poisoner. Elara went to him before the first child died. She warned him the water was tainted. She begged him to tell the people not to drink it. The crowd erupted in murmurs. This was a damning accusation, specific and horrifying. Lies, Blackwood shrieked, his voice shrill with panic. He is a devil, speaking with a serpent's tongue. Then tell them I'm lying, Reverend, Elias challenged, taking a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous, accusatory tone. Tell them why you bought up the land around that creek for pennies on the dollar just last month. Tell them about your plan to sell the land to the railroad for a depot, a deal that would be worthless if the land was declared poisoned. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. It wasn't just pride. It was greed. Blackwood's hypocrisy was laid bare for all to see, illuminated by the flames of the barn he himself had ordered burned. The mob was no longer a mob. They were a collection of stunned, betrayed men. They looked from the unarmed, bleeding rancher to their sweating, panicked preacher. The spell was broken completely. One by one, then in groups of 2 and 3, they began to lower their rifles. The fire in their eyes was gone, replaced by the dawning horror of what they had almost done. They turned their backs on Blackwood, the shame-faced silence a more potent condemnation than any shout. They began to drift away, melting back into the darkness from which they came, leaving their former leader standing alone, isolated and exposed in the damning light of his own fire. The battle was over. The last of the riders vanished into the darkness, their departure a quiet, shame-filled retreat. The only sounds left were the roar and crackle of the burning barn and the ragged breathing of the 3 people left in the yard. Reverend Blackwood stood alone, a pathetic figure stripped of his power, his face a grotesque mask of disbelief and hatred. He stared at Elias, his eyes wild. Then his gaze shifted to the cabin door, where Elara now stood, a silhouette against the firelight within. For Blackwood, she was the source of his ruin. With a final, guttural cry of pure rage, he lunged not at Elias but at her, his hands clawed, his intention to wreak one last act of vengeance. Elias reacted with the speed of a striking snake. He closed the distance in 2 long strides, his arm shooting out and catching Blackwood by the front of his coat. He didn't strike him. He didn't need to. He simply held him, lifting the smaller man partially off the ground, his face inches from the preacher's. It's over, Elias growled, his voice a low rumble of absolute finality. He shoved Blackwood away from him, sending the man stumbling backward into the dirt. The preacher fell in a heap, his fine black coat covered in mud and humiliation. He scrambled to his feet, gave one last venomous glare, and then turned and fled into the night, a coward running from the truth. Elias stood there for a long moment, his body trembling with the adrenaline of the fight. He watched the last of the fire consume what was left of his barn, the flames licking up into the starless sky, a funeral pyre for the hatred that had visited them. He turned and saw Elara walking toward him, her face streaked with soot and tears, but her eyes clear. They met in the middle of the yard in the space between the wounded cabin and the dying fire. They didn't speak. There were no words for what they had endured, for what they had become to each other. He reached out and gently brushed a smudge of ash from her cheek. She reached up and touched a crude bandage on his head. It was a silent conversation of shared survival, of mutual care. As the flames began to die down, casting long, fading shadows, the first hint of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon. A thin line of pale gray, then lavender, then rose. A new day was coming. They stood together, exhausted, battered, but unbroken. They had faced the ghosts of their pasts and the embodied prejudice of the world, and they had won. They had defended their small sanctuary, and in doing so had solidified its foundation, not with logs and nails, but with courage, truth, and a love that had been forged in the very heart of the fire. The threat was gone. The silence that descended now was not one of fear or grief, but one of deep, profound peace. It was the quiet of a new beginning. In the months that followed, the land began to heal, and so did they. The scar of the burned barn remained, a dark circle of ash on the earth, but Elias did not see it as a monument to loss. He saw it as a crucible, the place where their bond had been tempered into something unbreakable. He began the slow, arduous process of rebuilding. He felled trees, squared logs, and with a quiet determination, started to raise a new structure from the ashes of the old. It was not the same barn. It was stronger, built with a new purpose, a testament not to what was lost, but to what had endured. Elara, too, was an architect of this new life. The small garden she had started by the porch, once a tentative patch of green, now thrived under her knowing hands. It expanded, a riot of life and color. Rows of beans and corn stood tall, squash vines crept along the ground, and a vibrant patch of herbs, the same herbs that represented healing and life, filled the air with their pungent, beautiful scents. The garden was her answer to the fire, her defiant statement that life would always triumph over destruction. Their love, which had been born in silence and forged in violence, now settled into a quiet, comfortable rhythm. It was not a love of grand declarations or passionate drama. It was a love expressed in the language they had always shared, the language of small, gentle actions. It was in the way he would bring her a cup of water as she worked in the sun-drenched garden. It was in the way she would have a hot meal waiting for him at the end of a long day of labor. It was in the comfortable silence as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues, her head resting trustingly on his shoulder. Words were still used sparingly, but when they were spoken, they held a profound weight. "The corn is tall this year," he might say, and she would know he was saying, "Look what we've built. Look at the life we've made." "The tea will help you sleep," she might whisper, handing him a warm mug at night, and he would know she was saying, "I am here. I will care for you. Rest easy." They became a seamless unit, their lives interwoven like the threads of a sturdy tapestry. The ghosts of Martha and Samuel and of Elara's lost family did not vanish, but they were no longer haunting presences. They became gentle memories, honored ancestors of the new life that had been built upon the foundations of their loss. The cabin, once a place of suffocating grief, was now filled with the scent of baking bread, the sight of wildflowers in a jar, the sound of two people moving in quiet harmony. It was, finally and truly, a home. The loneliness that had defined Elias for so long was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding contentment he had never thought he would feel again. He had found peace not in solitude but in a shared existence with the woman he had rescued, the woman who, in turn, had rescued him right back. One evening, as the first stars began to prick the deep violet canvas of the dusk sky, they sat on the steps of the newly finished porch. The frame of the rebuilt barn stood stark and proud against the horizon, a symbol of their resilience. The air was cool and smelled of rich earth from Elara's garden and the clean, fresh scent of cut pine from the new barn. Elara leaned her head against Elias's shoulder, her braid falling across his chest. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. It was a posture they had adopted as their own, a simple, perfect expression of their quiet love. He looked out over the land, his land, which no longer felt empty and vast, but full and rich with the promise of a shared future. He was no longer a man haunted by the past, but a man grounded in the present, looking toward a future he had never dared to imagine. He thought of the starving, terrified creature he had found in the straw, and looked at the strong, vibrant woman beside him. He had offered her shelter from a storm, and she had given him back his life. She had taught him that strength was not just about fences and rifles, but about healing and growth. She had shown him that a home was not just a structure of wood and nails, but a space built of trust and shared light. Elara shifted, turning her face up to his. In her dark eyes he saw not a single shadow of the fear that had once defined her. He saw love, contentment, and a profound, unshakable peace. He saw his own reflection. He leaned down and kissed her, a gentle, lingering kiss that held all the unspoken words, all the shared trials, all the quiet joys of their life together. It was the kiss of gratitude, of promise, of a love as steady and enduring as the land itself. The camera of the mind pulls back, rising slowly, leaving the two figures on the porch, a small island of warmth and light. It soars over the thriving garden, over the proud new barn, over the vast, peaceful plain stretching out under the endless, star-dusted sky. Their story was a testament written on the hard canvas of the Wild West that even in the harshest of landscapes, in the deepest of sorrows, love could take root like a stubborn flower, and against all odds, it could bloom. Sometimes a person's world becomes a prison. It can be a prison of grief, like the one Elias Thorne built for himself after loss, where every day is a quiet, lonely penance. Or it can be a prison of fear, like the one that was built for Elara by a world that hated what it couldn't understand. You may have felt the walls of your own prison at some point in your life, the cage of a past mistake, a present sorrow, or a future you're afraid to face. The story of Elias and Elara is a reminder that the key to unlocking these prisons is often found in the most unexpected places and in the most unexpected people. It shows us that true strength isn't about being unbreakable, but about having the courage to be vulnerable. It's about finding the bravery to offer help and the humility to accept it. Elara offered a mended shirt. Elara offered a mended shirt. These small acts of kindness became the foundation for a love that rebuilt their world. They prove that courage isn't always a loud battle cry. Sometimes it's a quiet decision to plant a garden in barren soil. Sometimes it's the choice to stand up and speak the truth when everyone else is shouting a lie. Their journey teaches us that redemption is possible, that even the most broken spirits can be healed, and that the deepest wounds can be mended by the simple, powerful balm of human connection. If this story of courage, healing, and the redemptive power of love resonated with you, consider subscribing to our channel for more inspirational short films that explore the depths of the human heart. Your support allows us to continue creating stories that remind us all that even after the most devastating fire, something new and beautiful can grow from the ashes. Thank you for watching.